Most people don't realize this, but the moment an emotion appears, the mind treats it as evidence. If it feels heavy, it must be important. If it feels urgent, it must be real. If it hurts, it must mean something about you. This is the first misunderstanding. Emotions are not conclusions. They are outputs. They are the result of systems running in the background, systems that were designed to act fast, not to think clearly. An emotion does not arrive to tell the truth. It arrives to prepare the body. Fear prepares you to escape. Anger prepares you to confront. Shame prepares you to withdraw. Attachment prepares you to hold on. Preparation is not accuracy. These systems evolved in environments where hesitation meant death, and overreaction was safer than underreaction. So the emotional brain learned a rule: assume danger first, verify later. But the modern world rarely threatens survival. Yet the system still reacts as if it does. A delayed text feels like rejection. A neutral comment feels like criticism. A moment of uncertainty feels like failure. Not because those things are threats, but because they resemble old ones. The nervous system works on pattern recognition. It scans the present moment and asks a single question: have I felt something like this before? If the answer is even slightly yes, the response is triggered. This happens before logic, before context, before conscious thought. By the time you notice the emotion, your body has already decided what this moment means. And then the mind does something dangerous. It builds a story that explains the feeling, a story that justifies the reaction, a story that makes the emotion feel correct. I feel anxious, so something must be wrong. I feel offended, so they must be disrespecting me. I feel insecure, so I must be inadequate. The story doesn't need to be true. It only needs to match the feeling. This is how emotions gain authority, not because they're accurate, but because they arrive first. The mind mistakes speed for truth. The faster a reaction appears, the more convincing it feels. But automatic does not mean correct. Reflex does not mean reality. An emotion is simply the nervous system predicting what might happen next based on what has happened before. It is a forecast, not a fact. And like all forecasts, it can be wrong. The problem is not that emotions exist. The problem is that most people never learn to question them. They treat every internal reaction as a message about who they are, what the world is, and what must be done. That's where control is lost. Because the moment an emotion becomes truth, choice disappears. And the system, the automatic one, takes over. This is not awareness. This is obedience. If this made you pause, like the video. Subscribe if you want to keep observing. Here's where the problem deepens. An emotion appears once, then twice, then enough times that the mind stops seeing it as a reaction and starts seeing it as who you are. The nervous system learns through repetition, not through truth, not through insight, through frequency. Whatever fires often becomes familiar. Whatever becomes familiar feels reliable. And whatever feels reliable is trusted, even when it's wrong. This is how emotional patterns harden. Fear stops being a moment and becomes a lens. Anger stops being a signal and becomes a stance. Shame stops being a response and becomes a self-image. I'm just an anxious person. I'm bad at relationships. I'm not confident. These statements don't describe reality, they describe repetition. An emotional response that is never questioned eventually becomes unquestionable. And once that happens, the system protects itself. Fear encourages avoidance. Avoidance prevents contradiction, and the absence of contradiction keeps fear alive. This is the loop. Emotion to behavior to reinforcement. Not because the emotion was accurate, but because it was never challenged. The system never learns that it overreacted. Take anxiety as an example. An anxious response predicts danger, so the body tightens, the breath shortens, attention narrows. The mind scans for confirmation, and if you withdraw, cancel, delay, or avoid, the danger never arrives. But notice what the system learns: not that there was no danger, but that avoidance worked. Anxiety is reinforced by relief. This is why emotions feel so convincing. They are rewarded, not corrected. The nervous system is not asking, "Was this true?" It's asking, "Did this keep me safe?" Safety, not accuracy, is the priority. Over time, the emotion becomes predictive. You feel anxious before acting. You feel ashamed before speaking. You feel defensive before listening. The reaction now runs ahead of reality, and because it arrives early, it feels wise. This is how emotions start to feel like intuition. But intuition is quiet, refined, context-aware. Emotional reflex is loud, urgent, absolute. Confusing the two costs people years. They don't choose based on evidence, they choose based on internal weather. And the weather is shaped by the past. What hurt you once begins to rule you repeatedly, not because it's happening again, but because the system is afraid it might. So it tightens control, it limits risk, narrows possibility, shrinks movement. This is how a protective system turns into a prison, and the most dangerous part is that it feels reasonable. Because when an emotion has been obeyed long enough, disobeying it feels irresponsible, unsafe, almost wrong. But an emotion that cannot be questioned cannot be trusted. And a system that is never challenged never updates. That's where awareness must enter. Not to fight the emotion, but to interrupt its authority. If this made you pause, like the video. Subscribe if you want to keep observing. The shift does not begin by controlling emotion. It begins by reframing it. Not as an instruction, but as an activation. An emotion is the nervous system entering a prepared state. Fear is readiness. Anger is mobilization. Shame is concealment. None of these require belief. They require awareness. The moment you stop asking, "Why do I feel this?" and start asking, "What just turned on?" you step out of the loop. Because systems don't argue. They either run or they're observed. Observation changes behavior. When an emotion is noticed without being obeyed, the nervous system receives new data. It predicted danger, but danger didn't arrive. It prepared for loss, but nothing was lost. This is how recalibration happens, not through force, not through positive thinking, through contradiction. Repeated, calm contradiction. You feel anxiety, and you stay present. You feel shame, and you remain visible. You feel anger, and you delay reaction. Each time this happens, the system updates its expectations. Not immediately, but inevitably. At first, the space is small. A breath, a pause, a moment of restraint. But inside that space, choice returns. And choice weakens compulsion. This is the difference between feeling something and being ruled by it. The emotion still exists, but it no longer decides. Authority shifts. Over time, the nervous system learns that not every activation requires action, that intensity is not instruction, that urgency is not truth, and that presence is safer than avoidance. This is how emotional honesty is built, not by denying what you feel, but by refusing to confuse it with reality. You stop asking, "What does this mean about me?" and start asking, "What is this system trying to do?" The answer is always the same: protection. Not wisdom, not prophecy. Protection. Once you see that, compassion replaces obedience. You don't shame the reaction. You don't fight it. You let it pass without building a story around it. And in that silence, clarity emerges. Not loud, not dramatic, steady. You are not your emotions. You are the awareness they move through. And awareness does not need to rush. It waits. The mind does not seek happiness. It seeks recognition. What feels familiar feels safe, even when it hurts. This is the core mistake most people make when trying to change their lives. They assume the mind is wired to move toward what is good. It is not. It is wired to move toward what it knows. The nervous system does not ask, "Will this make me better?" It asks, "Have I survived this before?" If the answer is yes, the system relaxes, even if the experience was painful, especially if it was predictable. This is why people repeat patterns they claim to hate: unhealthy relationships, self-sabotage, emotional chaos, stagnation. Not because they want pain, but because the pain is mapped. The mind prefers a known hell over an unknown heaven, because uncertainty feels like danger, and danger demands control. Recognition reduces uncertainty. The moment the brain says, "I've been here before," tension drops, even if the outcome is suffering. Suffering that is familiar feels manageable. This is why change feels threatening, not because it's harmful, but because it is unmapped. New paths lack reference points, no memory, no pattern, no guarantee, so the system resists. The resistance is not laziness, it is protection. The mind is trying to keep you inside known terrain, even when that terrain is limiting. From the nervous system's perspective, repetition equals survival. The known outcome, even if negative, is preferable to unpredictability. This is why people leave progress right before it stabilizes. Growth introduces unfamiliar sensations, uncertainty, vulnerability, exposure, and unfamiliar sensations are interpreted as threat. The system doesn't differentiate between emotional risk and physical danger. Both trigger the same alarm. So the mind pulls you back to habits, back to thoughts, back to behaviors. Not because they're good, but because they're recognized. This is why willpower fails. You're not fighting desire, you're fighting conditioning. And conditioning doesn't respond to motivation, it responds to familiarity. Until this is understood, people keep asking the wrong question. Why do I keep doing this? The real question is, what does my mind recognize here that it's trying to return to? Change begins not when pain becomes unbearable, but when familiarity loses its authority. That comes later. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Recognition is not passive. It pulls. Once the mind recognizes a pattern, It begins to search for it. Not consciously, automatically. The nervous system scans experience for what it already understands. When it finds a match, relief appears. Tension drops. Even if the match is negative. This is how loops form. A familiar thought appears. A familiar emotion follows. A familiar behavior completes the cycle. The system relaxes. This relaxation is subtle, but it teaches the brain something important. Stay here. This makes sense. That message is more powerful than motivation because it bypasses choice. It feels right without being helpful. This is why people repeat the same inner dialogue for years, the same doubts, the same self-criticism, the same mental arguments. Not because they believe them, but because they're recognized. Familiar thoughts feel stable. They give shape to internal chaos, even if the shape is painful. The brain prioritizes coherence over comfort. A bad explanation is preferable to uncertainty. So the mind recycles narratives that already exist. I always mess this up. This is how it ends. Nothing changes. These thoughts aren't conclusions, they're anchors. They hold the system in known waters. Unknown waters require learning. Learning requires energy, and energy implies risk. So the system stays where it is, not out of weakness, but efficiency. Repetition saves effort. Breaking a pattern costs energy. From the brain's perspective, efficiency equals safety. This is why awareness alone feels uncomfortable at first. You're not just noticing thoughts, you're interrupting efficiency. The system reacts. It pulls harder. It intensifies emotion. It increases doubt. Anything to restore the loop. This is where most people stop. They mistake resistance for evidence. If this feels wrong, I must be doing something wrong. But resistance often means the system is losing familiarity. Recognition is being disrupted, and disruption feels like danger. The loop tightens right before it breaks, but breaking it requires something unfamiliar. Stillness, not action, not force, not replacement. Observation. That comes next. If this made you pause, like the video. Subscribe if you want to keep observing. The mind does not release a pattern because you understand it. It releases it when recognition stops being rewarded. Trying to replace a pattern keeps the system active. It's still engaged, still searching, still predicting. What weakens repetition is non-participation, not suppression, not resistance, just absence of reinforcement. When a familiar thought appears and no behavior follows, the loop starves. This is difficult because recognition demands response. It wants agreement, emotion, action. Silence feels wrong, but silence is data. It tells the system, this pattern is no longer useful. At first, the mind escalates. The thought gets louder, the emotion intensifies, the urge sharpens. This is not failure. It's the system checking if the old rules still apply. If you react, the pattern survives. If you observe, the pattern weakens. Observation creates unfamiliar territory. The mind has nothing to recognize, and without recognition it cannot repeat. This is where real change begins, not with effort, but with space. Space between thought and response. Space between emotion and identity. Over time, the nervous system updates, not because you forced it, but because the environment changed. The familiar no longer leads anywhere, so the system lets go. What replaces repetition is not certainty, but presence. Presence doesn't promise comfort. It offers clarity. And clarity does something familiar patterns never could. It allows choice. Not once, but consistently. That's how the loop ends. Reactivity is usually treated as a problem, something to control, something to eliminate, something to outgrow. But that framing misses something critical. Reactivity is not random noise. It is signal. Every trigger is specific, not to the situation, but to what the system believes is at risk. No reaction exists without a priority, something the nervous system has marked as essential. When a trigger appears, the system does not ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "Could this cost me something?" Cost is the key. Loss of safety, loss of control, loss of approval, loss of stability, loss of identity. Reactivity erupts when one of these feels threatened. That's why reactions feel personal, because they are tied to what once mattered for survival, even if it no longer does. The intensity of a reaction is not about the present moment. It's about the importance of the past lesson. If the system learned speaking up leads to rejection, then silence becomes protection. If it learned conflict leads to abandonment, then appeasement becomes safety. These strategies are not choices. They are adaptations. Reactivity is what remains when adaptation is no longer questioned. It's an old solution applied to a new context. That's why awareness alone can feel destabilizing. You're not just noticing reactions, you're threatening the protection system. The system tightens. It intensifies emotion. It speeds up thought. It demands action. Anything to keep its role. This is why trying to stay calm fails. Calm feels unsafe to a system built around defense. Defense needs urgency. So the question isn't, how do I stop reacting? The real question is, what does this reaction believe it's preventing? Embarrassment? Rejection? Powerlessness? Being unseen? Until that answer is clear, the reaction will repeat. Because protection without awareness has only one tool: reactivity. In the next part, we'll look at how to read reactions, not as failures, but as maps. If this perspective resonates, like the video. Subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. Triggers don't just activate reactions. They expose structure. Every trigger follows a path, not randomly, but precisely. The same words, the same tone, the same dynamic. Different people, same internal collapse. That consistency is information. It means something underneath is being touched every time. Triggers cluster around themes: being ignored, being corrected, being rushed, being compared. These themes are not accidents. They point to where safety was learned and where it was lost. The body remembers conditions, not narratives. It remembers what led to relief, what led to pain. So when a present moment resembles a past condition, the system responds. This is why triggers feel disproportionate. The stimulus is small. The response is not. Because the reaction is not to now, it's to then. This doesn't mean you're broken. It means the system is consistent. Consistency is not a flaw, it's a map. If you trace your triggers carefully, you'll notice repetition. The same emotional surge, the same urge, the same outcome. That repetition reveals design, and design implies purpose. The system is organized around preventing something specific, not discomfort, loss. Loss of voice, loss of control, loss of connection, loss of dignity. Once you see the pattern, you stop arguing with the reaction. You start listening to it. Not to obey, but to understand. In the next part, we look at how understanding, without forcing change, begins to soften the system itself. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Most people try to change reactivity at the level of behavior. They manage tone, they suppress expression, they control words. But reactivity doesn't originate at the level of behavior. It originates at the level of meaning. What the system believes is happening matters more than what is actually happening, because belief determines urgency, and urgency determines reaction, not logic, not intention. This is why forcing calm rarely works. You're asking a defensive system to stand down without addressing the threat it perceives. From the system's perspective, that feels reckless, almost dangerous. So it resists. It tightens emotion, sharpens thought, accelerates impulse, anything to regain control. Understanding changes this dynamic because it speaks the system's language. Not reassurance, recognition. When a reaction is met with curiosity instead of judgment, the system pauses. Not because it feels safe yet, but because it feels seen. Protection systems escalate when they're ignored. They soften when they're acknowledged. This is subtle but critical. You don't need to convince the system that it's wrong. You need to show it that you understand what it's trying to prevent. That understanding sounds like this. Of course you reacted. That once mattered. Not agreement, not surrender. Context. Context reduces urgency. Urgency fuels reactivity. When urgency drops, the pathway loosens, the reaction slows, the sequence stretches. And inside that stretch, something appears. Choice. Not dramatic choice, not perfect choice. A small one. A breath before speaking, a pause before defending, a moment before withdrawing. That moment is everything. Because that moment is unfamiliar to the system. It has no memory for it. And without memory, the system cannot predict. Prediction is the fuel of reactivity. Interrupt prediction, and the reaction weakens. This is how change happens without force. The system learns something new is possible. Not because you told it, but because you showed it through experience. You stayed present when it expected withdrawal. You delayed response when it expected defense. You remained visible when it expected hiding. Each time this happens, the system updates its map. Slowly. Reactivity doesn't disappear, it transforms. From command into suggestion. You still feel the surge, but it no longer decides. This is what integration looks like. Not emotional control, not emotional suppression. Emotional literacy. You learn to read the signal without obeying the alarm. And when the system realizes it no longer needs to shout, it quiets itself. Protection becomes guidance. Reaction becomes information. This is the final shift. You stop trying to defeat reactivity and start understanding what it was built to protect. That's when the system lets go. Not all at once, but for good. Most people believe they make decisions in emotional moments, that they choose to speak, choose to react, choose to walk away. But what actually happens is much quieter than that. In moments of emotional intensity, choice doesn't vanish dramatically. It narrows until there is only one path left, and that path feels inevitable. Notice how people describe emotional decisions. I had no choice. It just happened. I didn't even think. Those aren't excuses, they're descriptions, because real choice requires space, time, bandwidth, distance. Emotional load collapses all three. When emotion spikes, the nervous system shifts priorities. Speed replaces accuracy. Relief replaces reflection. Action replaces evaluation. The system is no longer asking, "What's best?" It's asking, "What ends this feeling fastest?" That question decides everything, not consciously, automatically. This is why emotional decisions feel urgent. Urgency isn't information, it's pressure. The sensation of, "I need to do something," is not choice asserting itself. It's the system demanding discharge, a way out of discomfort. Under emotional load, the brain reallocates resources. Regions responsible for reflection, comparison, and delay go quiet. And older, faster systems take over. These systems don't deliberate, they execute. They don't weigh options, they run patterns. That's why emotional decisions feel obvious in the moment and incomprehensible later. When the load drops, choice returns, but the action is already complete. Regret doesn't mean you chose wrong. It means awareness came back online. Too late. The illusion happens here, after the fact. The mind looks back and assumes, "I decided that." But what actually happened was execution. The system recognized a state, matched it to a past solution, and acted. No debate, no voting, no conscious author. Choice requires calm. Emotion doesn't just influence decisions, it replaces them. This is why trying to make better choices in emotional moments fails. You're asking a system in emergency mode to behave like it's safe. If a decision feels rushed, pressured, or inevitable, it isn't a choice. It's a system output. And understanding that is where responsibility actually begins. Next, we'll look at what is making the decision when you think you are. When emotion is high, something important shifts. The question is no longer, "What do I want to do?" It becomes, "What does the system know how to do here?" Under emotional load, the mind does not improvise. It retrieves. Old solutions, old exits, old defenses. This is where the illusion of choice deepens, because the action still feels intentional. You feel involved, you feel decisive. But involvement is not authorship, and decisiveness is not deliberation. A system output works like this. A state is detected, a pattern is matched, a response is deployed. No evaluation of alternatives, just execution. The system doesn't ask, "Is this the best response?" It asks, "What has reduced this feeling before?" That reduction might have been temporary, it might have been costly, it might have created long-term damage. None of that matters in the moment, because the system's priority is not your future, it's your immediate stability. This is why people say things they don't agree with later, why they send messages they wish they hadn't, why they leave, attack, freeze, or comply against their own values. Values are slow. Systems are fast. A conscious choice requires comparison. This option versus that one. This cost versus that benefit. This now versus later. Emotional load collapses comparison. Instead of multiple options, there is one dominant impulse, and impulses feel obvious. Obvious feels like truth, but obvious is often just familiar. This is where self-blame usually enters. I knew better. I should have stopped. I chose this. But knowing better is not the same as being able to choose better. Not under load. The system didn't consult your ideals. It consulted your history. What worked before? What ended discomfort? What restored balance? That's not weakness. That's conditioning. When people say, "I don't know why I did that," they're closer to the truth than they realize. Because the answer is rarely, "I wanted to." It's usually, "My system recognized this and ran what it knew." This reframing matters because it removes moral failure from mechanical process, and it points responsibility to the right place, not to the moment of reaction, but to the system that was trained long before it. In the next part, we'll look at why awareness almost always arrives after the action, and why that delay is not a personal flaw. It's structural. If this perspective resonates, like the video. Subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. After an emotional decision, something strange happens. Awareness returns. And when it does, it feels like failure. People say, "I should have known better. I saw it coming. I had a feeling." But that story is written after the action. The mind confuses hindsight with access. Because clarity feels so close, it assumes it was available all along. It wasn't. Awareness requires bandwidth, silence, distance, reduced intensity. Emotional load removes all three. During reactivity, attention collapses inward. The body dominates perception. Heart rate rises. Breath shortens. Muscles prepare. The mind narrows. There is no space for reflection because reflection is not useful to a system in defense. This is why insight feels delayed. Not because you ignored it, but because it was offline. The system didn't silence awareness. It outpaced it. Think of it this way. Awareness is a slower process. It integrates context, weighs consequences, holds contradiction. Systems don't do that. Systems act. They reduce threat. They restore equilibrium. They end discomfort. So when the emotion drops, when the body settles, awareness comes back online. And that's when regret appears, not as punishment, but as contrast. Contrast between what happened and what you value. Regret is not proof that you chose poorly. It's proof that choice has returned. The mind then rewrites the sequence. It inserts a fictional moment, a pause that never existed, and says, "I could have chosen differently." But there was no pause. This misunderstanding creates shame, and shame trains the wrong lesson. Instead of asking, "What system was running?" the mind asks, "What's wrong with me?" That question keeps the system intact because it never examines the process. Awareness doesn't fail in emotional moments. It's temporarily unavailable. Just like vision in darkness. You don't blame your eyes for not seeing in the dark. You change the conditions. This is the shift. Stop demanding awareness during emotional overload and start building it around it. Before the surge, after the collapse, between repetitions. That's where responsibility actually lives, not in the moment you lost control, but in the calm moments where the system can be seen. That's where choice is rebuilt. If choice disappears under emotional load, then it was never meant to live there. Real choice is not accessed in moments of intensity. It is built outside of them. Most people look for freedom at the wrong point in the sequence. They search for it inside the reaction, inside the surge, inside the urgency. But urgency is already too late. The system is running. Choice exists before the trigger, in preparation, in pattern recognition, in noticing what reliably precedes collapse. If the same situations produce the same outcomes, then the leverage is not in willpower. It's in anticipation. You don't wait for emotion to ask for choice. You decide ahead of time how you will meet it. This is how systems actually change, not by overpowering them, but by altering the environment they operate in. Different pauses, different delays, different defaults, small changes. A decision made in calm outlasts 100 decisions made in chaos. This is why practice matters, not motivational practice, but observational practice. Learning your signals, your sequences, your early warnings. The earlier you notice the activation, the more choice is available. Not perfect choice, but some. And some choice is all a system needs to update. Over time, something shifts. The reaction still appears, but it no longer feels inevitable. The illusion breaks. You stop asking, "Why can't I control myself?" and start asking, "Where can I meet this earlier next time?" That question restores agency without blame, without force. You're no longer fighting the system, you're redesigning it. That's what real choice is, not a heroic moment under pressure, but a quiet structure built in advance. And once you see that, you stop judging yourself for moments that were never choices to begin with. If this helped you see your reactions with more clarity and less self-judgment, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Stay observant. Most people think their reactions are spontaneous, that something just happens, and suddenly they're angry, anxious, defensive, shut down. But reactivity is not random, it is repeatable. And anything repeatable is not chaos. It's a system. If you look closely, you'll notice something unsettling. You don't react in new ways. You react in the same ways to different situations. Different faces, different words, different moments. Same internal sequence. The trigger changes, the reaction doesn't. That alone tells you something important. The cause is not the situation. It's the pathway underneath it. Reactivity follows a route, always the fastest one available, a shortcut built through repetition. The nervous system doesn't explore, it defaults. When a stimulus appears, the system does not ask, "What is this really?" It asks, "What does this resemble?" Resemblance is enough. The body reacts before the mind understands. This is why triggers feel immediate. There's no deliberation, no pause, no choice, because the pathway is already built. The sequence is almost always the same. A sensation in the body, a surge of emotion, a narrowing of attention, a familiar thought, a predictable behavior. This happens so fast it feels like a single event, but it's not. It's a chain reaction. Each link learned, each link reinforced. Over time, the system stops improvising. It runs the script. This is why you regret reactions after they happen. Not because you didn't know better, but because the knowing came too late. Awareness arrives after execution. By then, the system has already acted. Predictability is not a flaw, it's a clue. It proves there is structure beneath the reaction, and structure can be observed. If you reacted differently every time, there would be nothing to study, no pattern, no entry point. But you don't. You react the same way, which means the system is exposed. Reactivity feels personal, but repetition makes it mechanical. And the moment you see it as mechanical, you stop blaming yourself and start reading the design. That's where understanding begins. Next, we look at why the system chooses the same pathway every time, and what it's trying to protect. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Once a pathway exists, the system prefers it, not because it's correct, but because it's efficient. The nervous system is designed to conserve energy. Every decision costs effort. Every evaluation takes time. So the system defaults to what has already worked. Worked doesn't mean healthy. It means the threat passed. The body survived. That is enough. Survival is the only metric. When a reaction once reduced danger, even briefly, it gets stored. Not as a memory, as a root. Roots are reused. The more they're used, the faster they fire. Speed becomes preference. This is why, over time, reactions feel automatic. The system is no longer deciding, it's executing. Triggers don't cause reactions, they activate them, like flipping a switch that's already wired. And the older the pathway, the less conscious involvement it requires. Some reactions are older than language. They formed before explanation, before reasoning, before choice, which is why logic fails. You can understand a trigger and still react. Understanding does not reroute a system. New pathways require repetition, not insight, and repetition requires something unfamiliar, not reacting. When the system predicts danger and you respond differently, it receives conflicting data. Conflicting data forces recalibration. This feels uncomfortable. The system loses certainty. It escalates. Stronger emotion, urgency, convincing thoughts. Anything to return you to the known route. This is not resistance, it's inertia. The system has momentum. If you give in, the pathway strengthens. If you pause, the system is forced to wait. Waiting is disruptive. It introduces choice. Choice is expensive. It requires awareness, energy, time. But it's the only thing that interrupts automation. Reactivity continues not because you're weak, but because the system has never been challenged. That challenge doesn't come from force. It comes from delay. In the next part, we look at what delay reveals and how it exposes the system's true purpose. If this perspective resonates, like the video, subscribe if you want more. No pressure, just awareness. Every repeated reaction is protecting something, even the ones that ruin relationships, even the ones that sabotage progress. The system does not react to cause harm. It reacts to prevent loss. Loss of safety, loss of control, loss of belonging, loss of identity. Reactivity is defensive. If a reaction is intense, the protection is old. If it's rigid, the learning is incomplete. Predictability reveals priority. What fires fastest matters most to the system. Not consciously, but biologically. You don't react strongly to what's unfamiliar. You react strongly to what threatens something known. This is why certain triggers feel disproportionate. The situation is small, the reaction is not, because the present moment is activating the past. Reactivity is memory without images, stored as sensation, as urgency, as impulse. When you delay reaction, you interrupt defense. The system becomes visible. You feel what it's guarding: control, safety, approval, stability. This is the real value of predictability. It turns reaction into information. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" you ask, "What was that trying to prevent?" That question changes everything. It removes shame, it removes self-attack, and replaces it with curiosity. Curiosity does something reactivity cannot. It slows the system. When protection is seen, it no longer needs to shout. When it's acknowledged, it relaxes. This is how pathways dissolve, not by destruction, but by understanding. Reactivity feels personal. Predictability makes it readable. Readable systems can be changed. Not all at once, but permanently. That's the reveal. Identity doesn't appear all at once. It accumulates. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. Most people believe identity is chosen, that at some point they decided who they are. But identity is rarely formed by decision. It's formed by repetition. The mind notices what appears often, and what appears often starts to feel reliable. Reliability becomes familiarity, and familiarity becomes trust. If anxiety shows up every morning, the mind doesn't treat it as an event. It treats it as a feature. Not "this is happening," but "this is me." This is how internal weather turns into self-concept. A feeling repeats, then repeats again, then repeats without explanation. Eventually, it stops being questioned. What repeats stops being examined. It's assumed. The mind has a bias toward consistency. It wants a stable story to orient itself. So when the same internal state keeps appearing, the mind uses it as an anchor. I'm anxious. I'm detached. I'm intense. I'm cold. These don't start as identities. They start as descriptions. Descriptions that were repeated too often. At first, the label feels helpful. It explains the chaos. It gives shape to something uncomfortable. But explanation hardens. And once it hardens, it stops moving. The nervous system learns through exposure, not through accuracy. If a state dominates your inner life, the system assumes, "This must be who we are." Frequency is mistaken for truth. This is why identity feels solid, because repetition creates a sense of permanence, even when nothing about it is fixed. The mind doesn't ask, "Is this essential?" It asks, "Is this familiar?" And familiarity feels safe, even when it's limiting. This is how people grow attached to versions of themselves they don't even like, because letting go feels like losing orientation. When a state has been present long enough, its absence feels wrong. Not peaceful. Wrong. So the system keeps recreating it. Not intentionally, but automatically. This is the foundation. Before labels, before stories, before defense. Repetition makes experience familiar, and familiarity is where identity begins. Next, we'll look at how familiarity turns into labels, and why language locks identity in place. There is a subtle moment when repetition crosses a line. A feeling stops being something you experience and becomes something you are. This shift happens through language. Not dramatic language, not intentional declarations. Simple, everyday phrasing. I feel anxious becomes I am anxious. I feel distant becomes I'm cold. That grammatical shift changes everything, because language doesn't just describe, it stabilizes. The mind uses labels to reduce uncertainty. A named state feels manageable. Undefined experience feels dangerous. So when an internal state repeats, the mind looks for a container, a word, a category, an identity, something solid to hold the sensation. The label isn't chosen for accuracy, it's chosen for relief. Once a feeling has a name, the system relaxes. The chaos has an explanation. But labels do more than explain. They compress time. A temporary state is treated as a permanent trait. I'm anxious doesn't mean anxiety has been present recently. It implies this is stable, this is expected, this is me. And once a label forms, the mind reorganizes around it. Perception shifts, memory rearranges. Experiences that fit the label are remembered more easily. Experiences that contradict it are discounted, not consciously, but systematically. The label becomes a filter, and filters decide what gets noticed. This is how identity gains weight, not through truth, but through selection. When someone says, "I've always been this way," what they usually mean is, "I've been labeling this for a long time." The label provides stability, but stability has a cost. Once identity is named, the system defends it. Because losing the label feels like losing coherence. Who am I without this explanation? This is why identity feels fragile and rigid. The mind would rather be limited than undefined. So it keeps repeating the label, in thought, in speech, in interpretation, until the label feels unquestionable. At that point, the feeling no longer needs to repeat. The identity will recreate it. This is where the loop tightens. The state created the label, and the label now summons the state. Identity has formed, not because it was true, but because it was named. Next, we'll look at how identity begins to protect itself, and why once it forms, it resists contradiction. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Once identity forms, it doesn't sit quietly. It begins to organize experience, not aggressively, subtly. Identity acts like a filter. It decides what gets noticed, what gets ignored, and what gets explained away. When someone believes, "I'm anxious," the mind doesn't scan for calm. It scans for confirmation. Calm moments pass unnoticed. Anxious moments stand out. This isn't dishonesty. It's efficiency. The system prefers information that keeps the story intact. Contradictions create friction. They force reevaluation, and reevaluation threatens stability. So the mind protects the identity by narrowing perception. What fits is remembered. What doesn't is minimized. This is how identity becomes convincing, not because it's accurate, but because it's constantly reinforced. Behavior adjusts to match the label. Someone who believes they're cold stops reaching out. Someone who believes they're intense stops softening. These behaviors then generate evidence. Distance creates loneliness. Intensity creates conflict. The outcome confirms the identity. It keeps happening, they say, without realizing they're helping it happen. Identity doesn't just describe behavior, it selects it. Over time, the loop tightens. Perception feeds belief. Belief shapes behavior. Behavior produces outcome. Outcome reinforces belief. At that point, identity feels undeniable, because everything seems to support it. This is where people say, "I've always been this way." But always usually means for as long as this loop has been running. The most dangerous part is not the identity itself. It's the absence of alternatives. When identity hardens, new experiences are filtered out before they register. Growth feels unnatural. Change feels fake. Even relief can feel threatening, because it doesn't fit the story. This is why identity defends itself, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. And familiarity to the nervous system means safety, even when it limits you. This is the trap. Identity promises stability, but delivers confinement. Breaking this loop doesn't happen by attack. It happens by loosening. That's what comes next. In the final part, we'll look at how identity can soften without collapsing. Identity does not dissolve when you argue with it. It tightens, because identity hears attack as threat. This is why trying to change who you are often backfires. The system responds defensively. It protects the story that has kept things coherent. Identity isn't rigid because it's strong. It's rigid because it's afraid of collapse, afraid of ambiguity, afraid of not knowing what to expect from yourself. So attacking identity feels like destabilization, and destabilization triggers protection. Loosening identity works differently. It doesn't challenge the label, it challenges the ownership. Instead of saying, "I'm not anxious," you notice, anxiety is present. That distinction matters. One claims essence, the other observes state. States move, essence feels fixed. The moment experience is observed instead of possessed, identity begins to loosen. Not dramatically, quietly, like tension leaving a muscle you didn't realize was clenched. You don't need to deny the pattern. You don't need to replace the label. You only need to stop reinforcing it. That means noticing repetition without narrating it, feeling anxiety without concluding, "This is who I am." The system learns through exposure. When a state appears and no identity is built around it, the loop weakens. The feeling comes, and it goes, without becoming a statement about self. At first, this feels unsettling. Identity provided orientation. Without it, there's space. But space is not emptiness. It's possibility. As identity loosens, something else becomes visible. You are not the pattern. You are what notices the pattern. And what notices is not anxious, not cold, not intense. It's stable. This is where flexibility returns, not by redefining yourself, but by refusing to freeze experience into definition. Identity stops being a cage. It becomes a description, temporary, adjustable, incomplete. You don't lose yourself here. You recover range, the ability to feel differently without questioning who you are. That's the shift, from identity as truth to identity as habit. If this helped you see yourself with more clarity and less attachment, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. Stay observant,